Hello and welcome to week three. This week we're going to talk about the Fourth Amendment. We're going to talk about search warrants. We're going to talk about exceptions to the search warrant requirement. Um, just lots of fun stuff like that. And it's difficult. Constitutional law is difficult primarily just because it's always somewhat evolving. And to some extent, it's also sometimes slightly different in different parts of the country um, because it we operate um, under not just like Supreme Court decisions and stuff, but the different various state court and the way that our authority is as state and local law enforcement officers is derived from the state statutes, which is obviously going to be different from state to state. And so, even things that would pass constitutional muster in terms of the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court decisions and such, uh, might be might be more restrictive where you live. And so, therefore, um, what we have to do as law enforcement officers, obviously in the academy, we get a basic, lesson about what the current landscape of case law is at the time that we go through the academy. But then on an annual basis, we usually have the opportunity to go to, well, more recently, like online based kind of training that covers not only new legislation and new laws and revisions to laws and things like that that happen each year, but also relevant case law as it applies to police procedure. Um, so over the course of my career, some things have changed. So, and I realize this is the first video that you're watching, most likely, and therefore you probably haven't watched the lessons on all the exceptions or anything like that. So I'll try to keep this kind of surface level. But whenever I first became a law enforcement officer, search incident to arrest, which is one exception to the search warrant requirement, it would cover the entire vehicle if you arrested somebody out of a vehicle. So if I pulled somebody over and I arrested the driver for having a failure to appear warrant on a traffic ticket, um, I could search the whole vehicle. It didn't matter what I arrested them for. That was the case law. That was the precedent, and that's how it was done all over the country at that time. Then there was a court case in 2011 called Arizona v. Gant, and that challenged it. It is basically like I was just saying, the officer arrested the person, but what they really had no probable cause to search the vehicle. But they had this exception of exigent circumstances. And so basically, the court then kind of reversed course from their prior decision and said, uh, more narrowly described the exception. So, for example, you still have the right to search incident to arrest, and that search includes the person that you're arresting and the area inside the basically the grab area, the immediate area of the subject. So if if we end up, let's say that they resist arrest, right, and we have a scuffle on the couch or whatever, and I finally get them into cuffs, I could search the couch. Or if for whatever reason that fight occurs inside of a vehicle, I could search that area of the vehicle that they would have had reach of. Um, and the exception or the case itself said also, like, you could also search the vehicle for evidence of the crime that you arrested them for. So if I arrest somebody for, let's say, DWI, I could search the car for evidence of drug or alcohol that would be present in the vehicle. If I arrest somebody for drug possession, I can search the vehicle for more drugs. But really, that's not so much incident to arrest at that point. That would be the probable cause exception for the motor vehicle, specific to a motor vehicle, which is something else that we're going to learn about this week. So the point that I'm trying to get at is there's a patchwork of appeals that have taken place over the last, well, over the course of the history of the United States. But especially within the last 50 to 100 years, 60 to 100 years, that impacts our day to day operations in law enforcement. And in order for you to be a competent patrol officer, you have to know what the limits of your authority are. You have to know where you're allowed to operate without a warrant and where you're not. And so it's not enough for you to say, oh, I can look it up or whatever. You may not have time to. You may have to make judgments, very quick judgments about how you're going to proceed, and you don't necessarily have the luxury of that. Now, we always have, we usually have the option to consult with somebody a little more learned than us, when we're rookies and things like that. But at some point, you become the more learned one. And in some cases, in a lot of cases where it's not an emergency or something like that, you may even have time to contact one of the prosecutors or assistant prosecutors to ask questions like that. I've gone to the prosecutor's office several times where they've said, I don't know that you really need a warrant for this. And I'm like, I'd rather have it than need it and not have it, because that's the danger of operating on an exception. And we have to operate on an exception in several of these areas. But the danger of doing so is that you don't get approval in advance. And so essentially you go from getting advanced approval, which makes the odds of having anything thrown out like virtually zero, to that whole, like, you're asking for approval after it's done. So if I submit an affidavit and a request for a search warrant to the prosecutor's office, and they don't, the judge and the prosecutor don't grant it, they decide that, yeah, this isn't quite enough. I'd like to have more proof, and they might even have suggestions to me. I mean, it's not necessarily a you're in trouble for turning this in thing, but hey, how about you try doing this, and this might get you more, a little bit more evidence, because I think this is, pretty weak. And so I have the opportunity to do that. I can get more evidence, and then I can reapply a day later, a week later, or a month later, or whatever, and it's fine. Whereas if I think I have an exception and I move forward in an exigent circumstance or something, I mean, ultimately the judge, if he doesn't agree that that was reasonable, then that could be thrown out. Or even if the judge agrees, I mean, it could be turned over on appeal. That Arizona v. Gant decision, like those officers at the time operated under the case law that applied at the time. They did it by the book, so to speak, at the time. They searched the vehicle because they were lawfully allowed to under the current case law. It's just their case ended up being the one that where the Supreme Court narrowed the exception, because they said that wasn't really what their intent was with it, or they didn't believe that's what their intent was with it. So all that to say, I know this is boring, dry material, but it's also essential, that you have to understand the basics of this in order to do your job. Um, there's no avoiding it that there's circumstances where we act without a warrant and we are getting that, asking for forgiveness rather than permission, you know. But there's also some cases where it's borderline gray area, whatever, or you've got time, so you might as well do it. Um, and another thing to think about or to look at is what kind of case is this, too, so a lot of times, you're a lot of the things we do in and around vehicles, become kind of misdemeanor, kind of crime, kind of stuff. And so we just really don't have the time to be getting warrants like that. And a lot of patrol officers don't really do search warrants because it's so common that they have those other exceptions on the table that it really, kind of falls on detectives and higher ranking people to do those things on the more complicated cases. So that being said, that's all I have for you now. But I'll see you next week.